This program is presented by University of California Television. Like what you learn? Visit our website or follow us on Facebook and Twitter to keep up with the latest UCTV programs.
Welcome to A Conversation with History. I'm Harry KREISLER of the Institute of International Studies. Our guest today is Ralph J. Cicerone, who is the president of the National Academy of Sciences and chair of the National Research Council. His research in atmospheric chemistry, climate change, and energy has involved him in shaping science and environmental policy at the highest levels nationally and internationally. Dr. Cicerone served as Chancellor of UC Irvine from 1998 to 2005. He is the 2016 Hitchcock Lecturer at Berkeley. Dr. Cicerone, welcome to our program.
Thanks, and good morning.
Where were you born and raised?
Western Pennsylvania, a little city called Newcastle, Pennsylvania. I stayed there till I was about 18 years old.
And looking back, how do you think your parents shaped your thinking about the world?
It was a close family, not worldly in that sense. It was a close family, second generation of Italian immigrants, so there tended to be an extended nuclear family, very warm, lots of wonderful aunts and uncles, and I would say family-centered. So not much thinking about the outside world, actually.
And when did you get the science bug? In high school or earlier, or was it later in college?
It was later. I was not I guess what you'd call a science fair kind of a kid. I didn't do that kind of thing. I was all about sports, athletics, anything that was in season, that's what I did. And the school was not very challenging, the schools where I went. So I was able to make it through without too much studying.
And you were a baseball player back then, or was it later?
Both. And football and basketball and golf, just anything that was in season. So that's what I loved, and it wasn't until I went away to college that I learned at all about what it was like to learn and what college meant. And even later than that, I began to hear about graduate degrees, which I had no inkling of what they were.
And looking back, what do you think you learned from sports that may have impacted your later career in science?
I think quite a bit. Assessing one's own strengths and weaknesses and realizing that you can compensate for some of those with teammates and help each other out. And then, I'm making this up now, but
no.
Just thinking back,
yeah.
The idea of meeting challenges and that it's not always going to be easy, that was good for me to learn.
And then you went to MIT.
I did.
And at MIT, what did you major in?
Electrical engineering. It wasn't what I started out thinking, but at the time, electrical engineering was just very a sweeping kind of a subject involving mathematics and physics, and it had a reputation for being hard and that it was important, and so it was attracting students left and right at MIT. So I didn't really know what I was doing. I had a little bit of interest in chemistry, but didn't like the first year's chemistry at all, so I just moved immediately into electrical engineering, which so many other students were doing. It turned out to be exciting and challenging, and I had a hard time at first. I wasn't very well prepared.
But then then you went on to graduate school at the University of Illinois. Mm-hmm. Undergraduate work was at MIT.
Right.
And so when did the change to climate studies begin, and why? Why did you move from one field to the other?
That came much later. I didn't have much of a plan. I didn't know what careers meant. I went to college to be able to get a job. Western Pennsylvania, when I grew up, and still has a lot of unemployment, a lot of instability. So my idea of going to college, that no one in my family had ever gone to college before. So I didn't know what I was doing, and I thought it was all about being employable. So going into engineering in the wake of the Sputnik flights, seemed like a national priority and a way to get a job, so that's what I did. It wasn't until, I think, a required research project in my senior year at MIT that I began to see that there were other things than just textbooks and learning what somebody put in front of you, but a more open-ended challenge of doing research. And I really liked it. I spent so much time on my senior research project, and it probably really didn't achieve much, but I thought it did, and it was fun.
And then when did you undertake climate studies? Was it late in graduate school?
Way after that. I finished a PhD in electrical engineering and the physics of plasmas, and got interested, or was assigned, to work on the Earth's ionosphere. And, you know, you and I may look old to some of our viewers, but this wasn't that long ago. But the world was different. To communicate, let's say, from the United States to Australia, around the world, we didn't have communication satellites catching these signals and relaying them. We had to shine beams of radio transmission and reflect them off of the ionosphere, which is a natural feature of nature, ionized gas, and through those reflections communicate around the world, for example. So this was important stuff commercially and even for the military. So it was an exciting field, and I began to learn then a little bit about the Earth using these electromagnetic pulses of energy, radio waves, to communicate around the world and also to study this layer of ionized material around the Earth. And that began to get me interested in, well, where the atmosphere came from. Where does this air come that we breathe? How does it remain so stable, and so forth? So probably over the next 15 years, I inched my way to climate change, but I went through the ozone layer.
I like to ask my guests, we'll get back to your research in a minute, what they see as the skills and temperament required for doing what they do. So to be a scientist, how would you advise, or how should students think about the skills they need and the temperament to do the work of science?
Well, the wisest advice that everybody always says is that you have to be as well prepared by learning the fundamentals of serious subjects like mathematics and physics and chemistry and so forth. And then by being prepared, you might be able to make a leap that's based more on intuition or imagination. I'm not sure I agree with that. I think a little bit of everything is needed, certainly some preparation and doing well in one's studies, but it's very different to study out of a book and to pass an examination, whether the examination is a test of what you've learned or your readiness to move on to something else. That's very different from doing research, in my view. To step out into something new without anything to rely on is very different than it is to simply reproduce something that's already been done. But both skills are needed, so it's really a beautiful pursuit, I think, because once again, you realize that different human qualities and attributes are needed. Perseverance is almost always required because you make mistakes. And instead of just kicking yourself, you have to hang in there. So perseverance is important. Preparation, there's 2 P's. I don't know what the third P would be. But I think incentive is really important, being interested in something.
Mm-hmm. And curiosity is important because at one point I read where you said that you moved into climate sciences because you thought there were a lot of interesting problems and discoveries to be made.
Yes, and that was the case when I first started the research on the ozone layer too. So little was known that when we finally plunged into it, we were able to make some discoveries and some movement forward because so little was known. So that's another thing. There are perhaps at least 2 kinds of people who do this work. One is the type who wants to be able to start off in a library and read all the background and what has been tried, what has not been tried, and so forth, before moving forward. And the other kind is perhaps more cavalier, just jump into the unknown and learn things in kind of a backfilling way. Again, I think both kinds of people are valuable.
And to be the second kind, you really have to be comfortable with yourself and able to deal with uncertainty and criticism.
And maybe overconfidence. Overconfidence, right? Because so, as you know from what we all know about history of any endeavor, so many of the ideas that we think are new turn out to be old ideas. And if we just would have taken the time to look into the history, we would have known that. But it's really fun to discover something for yourself, even if it's not new. Even if you find out later that you did something that other people have already done, but you did it yourself with nobody telling you how to do it. That's fun.
And a lot of times you're doing things that, in other words, calls into question what your colleagues have been saying about a particular subject matter.
Well, that's true even today in scientific research. A scientist doesn't become respected and the object of other people's trying to imitate if he or she simply repeats what other people have done and gets the same answers. It's the breakthroughs that show that something has been missing, or that there's an important connection that hasn't been made, or a consequence. So that's what we all try, and it's pretty competitive.
And I think I read somewhere that you talked about, what did you call it? You called it the combination of freedom and responsibility. So that in a way, you're asking a question, but it has to be tested against the facts and reality.
Yes.
And that's very important.
I think this is one of the biggest breakthroughs in human pursuits of all kinds the last several hundred years, to be able to measure something and compare with a reality. And that science really should have some predictive capability as well. So when we think about theories and implications, we should be able to generate a prediction that can then be verified or falsified. That's how we make progress. But it doesn't always have to be so formal. Sometimes it's just a random walk.
And you make the point that the beauty of science, you touched on it a minute ago, is it's self-correcting. Mm-hmm. It's a system where you wind up correcting yourself based on the facts because of the question you've asked, but also your colleagues and people working in the field will also be a test for you of the validity of what you're saying.
And that's what makes science progressive. But from a broader societal point of view, that self-correcting attribute of science is really important. Sometimes we make mistakes, but if it's an important area, for example, a medical matter that has wide attention, people who are suffering, who are looking at the implications, something important like that with commercial applications or security or environmental things like this, anything that attracts attention, and if it's in error, it will be caught very soon. So for example, the times when people try to falsify anything in science, they're really very limited because the odds are if it's anything important, you're going to get caught quickly. But of course, the most common type of error is one that was unintentional. It could be because of biases, or it could be because just of a bad experiment that wasn't done right. But that self-correcting attribute of science is really important from a human point of view.
When you think of science, you think of, maybe mistakenly, of somebody alone in a lab working away. But one of the interesting things for you is that it's not just doing the science, the pure science, and getting it right, but also the implications of that science for the way we live in our environment. Talk a little about that, because that seems to have been an important factor in your motivation about what you study.
For me, yes. Not for everybody. There are there are some very, very important scientists, whether they be economists or mathematicians or physicists, who focus on a deep implication or some new kind of test or measurement that can be made that no one else has ever done before, and no one else is interested in it. That kind of individual progress is absolutely stunning, and it's necessary. Many other projects, though, do require group participation and complementary capabilities that we can teach each other, but in the end, there may be a group of people over there who are doing part of the experiment that you and I would never understand, but yet we need them. But the awareness of implications, for example, societal or human, for, let's say, the sustainability of the planet, or whether it's an economic consequence, this also drives a lot of scientists. To know that after all those years of studying and mastering a subject, they can now apply it in some way that will have real implications on real people. Even there, though, you have this bifurcation again. You can do an experiment in a laboratory, let's say in biology, that could understand a universal truth that affects all organisms, even though you weren't interested in the implications at all. But it can still have these sweeping implications. Being aware of all these implications, though, is really important.
Talk a little about creativity in science, because you're going down in a course, you've identified a problem, you're observing, getting the data to disprove it or prove what you're assuming, but then there's that eureka moment when you see something and open up a field. Talk a little about that.
Well, that's really fun. It doesn't happen to most of us very often, but when it does, it's very self-reinforcing. I think part of it comes out of self-criticism, though. I remember in graduate school, toward the end of my PhD work, I heard that one professor had a kind of a metric or a criterion, it was a man, that he used in evaluating students. When the student began to be able to detect his own errors, and he was that self-critical that he could find out his own mistakes before someone else pointed them out, that was a sign that he or she was ready to get a PhD. And that registered on me, and I think it's true. Being self-critical so that you don't make erroneous discoveries, and you can always check what you're doing as you go along and say, gee, I'm really into something new now, and it's not because I've made mistakes, but because I've checked my progress all the way through, and I've arrived at a point that no one else has ever seen before. The light goes off, and it's really fun.
And does part of that self-criticism come from the universe you're embedded in? That is, you're anticipating the criticism that your colleagues will make.
Yes. Like most endeavors, it's pretty competitive. So, and we're also educated and trained as upcoming scientists to not make mistakes. We don't want to mislead people. We want to be right. We want to show that the measurement is really accurate, and that if it's off a little bit, it's not too far. So this is deeply ingrained in us to not make mistakes. So there is some caution. Also, when a scientist makes a truly big discovery that everybody wants to pay attention to, newspapers and interviewers and so forth, there's an element of jealousy, maybe even some suspicion. If this same person, his face is out there all the time claiming something new and how important it is, the competitors get a little tired of that. And they want to make darn sure that this person who's maybe bragging, maybe posturing, or maybe announcing something important, but be very sure he's right. We don't want any false posturing.
Let's now go back to your early work, because you did some early work that was very important on the ozone layer and the effect of chlorine gases. Talk a little about that and how you got into that. Well,
I was trying to switch fields, to switch my area of emphasis from these ionized gases around the Earth to something that was more relevant, more related to day-to-day existence, or at least life processes and so forth. And in those days, we didn't know much about the ozone layer, but it was starting to become clear that it was part of the Earth's environmental stability system. In this case, the natural ozone layer absorbs ultraviolet light that comes out of the sun, and if it weren't for the ozone layer, that ultraviolet light would reach the surface, where it can break up proteins in your skin and cause skin cancer amongst light-skinned people and damage plants and so forth. So we knew that it was important, but we really didn't know what was controlling it. It's like you're trying to create a budget, how much of it is produced and how much of it is destroyed. So somebody here at Berkeley, Harold Johnston, had helped to work out how a special kind of chemical process called catalysis involving nitrogen oxides was helping to counterbalance the natural production of ozone. So my colleague and I just went looking for other chemistry that could be important, that would be connected to all of that, and we stumbled on the idea that the chemical element chlorine could destroy ozone under the right circumstances. So we started researching it and going back through old laboratory studies and made this proposal. It was original, it was good, it turned out to be right, but we missed the most important part of it. The most important part was that humans were already involving some chlorine compounds in their daily lives and commerce that were already damaging the ozone layer, these chlorofluorocarbon gases in aerosol spray cans and refrigerators. That turned out to be the important discovery by someone who had just finished Berkeley grad school, actually, Mario Molina and his colleague Sherry Rowland. And this set of discoveries really opened up a lot of new research that many, many of us knew that it was important to get to the bottom of this whole phenomenon. How much more growth in that industry could be accommodated by Earth's natural healing processes versus when we would go past a tipping point and cause a breakdown in the ozone layer of some kind. So for the next, people are still working on these issues. And it's led to international agreements that were remarkably successful.
Talk a little about the evolution of the field of climate studies. Mm-hmm. When you started in, people had been working on this, but the field really took off as you became interested in the subject matter yourself.
Well, it was probably the opposite, that I became more and more involved because I saw that the field was taking off in the sense that it was getting to look important. This was years and years and years before the public was aware of it, but we began to see data coming in that suggested that climate change was going to occur ever more rapidly. It was much the same set of notions and scientific input that got me involved in the ozone layer. In this case, the notion is that human activities are on a large enough scale and of a particular type that they can affect the entire global physical environment, not just dirtying our own nests with air pollution in one city, but causing very stable chemicals to spread all through the global atmosphere that can then leverage the entire Earth's energy budget and change the climate. This had become clear conceptually, and all the pieces that we could evaluate looked pretty solid. And today, in 2016, of course, people are digging more and more deeply into the details to figure out what are the detailed implications for regional, geographically regional climates. What's the time scale going to be? Sea level rise. All of those possibilities were alive back in the early 80s, late 70s, but an awful lot of exploration remains to be done.
In addition to being a leader in this particular field, you've been someone who's led in the organization of the settings in which this kind of research could occur. You came to UC Irvine and helped establish an interdisciplinary department there in geosciences. Talk a little about that. I mean, because that's a different kind of science leadership that is very important as more and more resources have to be made available to take an even broader and deeper picture of what's going on.
Yeah, this is one of the few times in my career where I've actually planned something. Usually I just let things happen and do what I'm interested in. But in that case, I had seen these two powerful examples of human activities capable of affecting the entire planet, and not necessarily in a limited way. It wasn't clear that things could remain stable. So I began to think, you know, we need a better way that those of us involved can learn the other components of the action so that we don't make a bunch of stupid mistakes, but also begin to educate the next generation of young people. I was pretty young at the time, so I'm not saying that we were focusing on teenagers. And I waited to see what would happen around the world's universities, say, how are universities going to respond? And I wasn't seeing much action. So when I heard about an opportunity to start a completely new approach in a graduate program at one of the UC campuses, Irvine, I looked into it at first, and I volunteered to help them to plan the program. But after a couple of visits, I began to realize, you know, nothing else is going on when I look around the world. Everybody seems to be waiting for somebody else to make a move. And there were some disciplinary issues, like should everybody have a PhD in physics before they start this kind of work? Should everybody have a PhD in chemistry before they start this kind of work? Or could these concepts be incorporated earlier? So we entered that idea of starting the program as a bit of a risk, not knowing exactly how to go, but it's gone very well. The driving notion was, and I think that the summary of the mission of the program was to detect and quantify large-scale trends in the environment, like air and water and land, to understand their causes and to predict the future. So we never used the words physics or chemistry or biology, but we focused on the phenomena with the premise that human-caused disturbances are going to be a serious part of the future. On the other hand, we always have to look for natural causes, so we can separate out what humans are doing from purely natural phenomena.
It sounds like you're saying that in terms of the field in general, that a lot of was going on in different discrete areas, and part of the task here was to bring it all together and train people to take the next step.
Yes, from an educational point of view, what were the rudiments in understanding, in this case, the behavior of the Earth as a linked biological and physical system? Then how is it going to happen organizationally? Where would the resources come from? And how could we make sure that our graduates and the research in the department were speaking to the issues? So a lot of things had to be done. We had to talk to the federal agencies in the United States who support the research, what kinds of facilities could be built. Was the University of California faculty ready for something like this? But the idea caught on.
And what about technology? I guess what is going on in the course of this evolution is that new ways of gathering data become very important, and it opens up a whole new perspective and a way to validate the information you're gathering.
I think you're absolutely right. In fact, more than I expected. I can look back just over the last few years, 10 years, and see when certain instruments, certain technology were proposed for development that I didn't think would ever work. They're now yielding incredibly valuable data on Earth's climate. And this is stunning. The miniaturization of devices, their stability, the places they can look, our ability to store data and to handle the data without causing errors in the retrieval of information, just like your handheld devices. All of these things were unforeseen. To be able to process so much data without errors, and to be able to have the satellite pick out your telephone for your personal communication from all the signals without making any errors. This is fascinating stuff.
What did you learn from this experience of, in essence, organizing a new discipline, a new interdisciplinary discipline, and then you moved on to being chancellor? In other words, were there surprises for you, insights about leadership that you didn't have until you actually were doing it?
Yes, again, you've hit on a good point. I didn't appreciate the value of leadership for most of my life. Now I realize that with the right circumstances, a leader in a position can make a big difference. So it's a combination, obviously, of balancing the interests and capabilities of people against what might be the task at hand. But in many institutions, leadership really does matter. And I began to learn that. So in between, I was dean of the College of Physical Sciences for a while. So I was dealing with physics, chemistry, mathematics, and this Earth system science, and learning what the different pursuits were and how the education of students in the programs could be affected by the others. It was really important and allowed me to make better decisions when I became chancellor, I think.
When you left the chancellorship, you became president of the National Academy
right.
and chairman of the National Research. Talk a little about that role and the differences with the other roles you've had.
Okay. In the middle of the Civil War in the United States, the Congress and President Lincoln created the National Academy of Sciences. It's amazing to me, the more I've learned about it, that they did this, because here you were in the middle of this brutal Civil War with the outcome not determined, whether there was going to be one country that emerged or not. They did two or three amazing things in 1862 and 1863. One of them was the creation of the National Academy of Sciences to help to lift the future United States of America to be on a par with Europe scientifically, by raising standards, by organizing pursuits, by helping to prioritize resources and so forth. But they also created the Morrill Land Grant Act, which, as you know, created some of the best public universities in the United States as we see them today, to permit higher education to be more accessible to a much larger number of people than could go to these small private universities in 1862. These were amazing feats. Well, getting back to the National Academy of Sciences, the mission was not only to elevate the standards and quality and activity of American science, but also to be available to help the government. So of all the world academies of sciences in different countries, as I've now learned, ours is almost unique, certainly distinctive, that we have no direct payment from the federal government. They don't pay us to exist, but they will ask us to do projects that are important in the public policy arena. And on a project-by-project basis, we then do help the government as a completely independent analyst and advisor. Sometimes the tasks that they give us are kind of prosaic, kind of everyday things. Sometimes they're kind of cosmic tasks that we have to undertake. But the idea of the government creating a body that in some cases would have a almost decisive role that would not be under the control of the government, that was really rather bold of the United States government to do in 1863, and we try to live up to it. We try to be independent and objective, nonpartisan. Some of the requests are kind of strange. We have to argue back and forth with the government on what the focus should be, but we try to play it completely straight and objectively, and we produce about 150 reports every year on these topics.
And how are you funded?
Pretty much project by parts of Congress or different federal agencies, sometimes by private foundations, philanthropy. So it's a complicated mix.
Now, before you became president, President Bush asked you to chair a report on climate change. And what I'm curious about, were you surprised by the politicization that followed in the debate about climate change, not just from the report, but just the general setting of the way science is viewed today because of that politicization?
Yes, we could talk about that particular report from 2001, maybe a little later. But yes, the degree to which this whole discussion about Earth's climate change has become politically partisan, especially in the United States. There are only one or two other countries where it's become partisan. But in the United States, it's terribly partisan. I don't even understand how this has happened. Not only is it unnecessary and destructive, but it's not even understandable. Because historically, for example, the Republicans have been pretty supportive of basic research in this country. So to have so many of them turn on this issue and say that it's somehow erroneous or even fraudulent is just stunning to me. I don't understand how it's happened.
Is it because of the interests involved? Because if you're talking about cutting carbon, you're talking about the use of petroleum, among other things.
We could probably talk all day on all of the reasons. Some of them is that this situation could lead to a regulatory environment which is not favored by many people in different industries. It's inconvenient. For example, fossil fuels, liquid fuels like gasoline have a real advantage when you're trying to create transportation. We now know that that's not the only way to fuel transportation. Electricity, for example, from renewable sources can also fuel transportation. But there's a convenience to using what we've always had. The availability of coal has been a big part of Western civilization for what, 150 or 200 years? 300 years? And to suddenly, turn our back on it is, I think it leaves a lot of people cold. And I don't mean that literally, I mean it figuratively. So there's a lot of reasons why you can look back and say this issue has become partisan. Certainly the way the newspapers and many commentators talk about climate change, there might be one sentence on the science and something that's been measured, and then the next 350 sentences are about the politics or competing interests. So it's a tough issue.
What about let's go back to the report that you did before you were president. What do you see as the main contribution of that report, the main insight?
Well, it was structured. The White House asked the Academy to give them answers to 12 or 13 questions, specific questions. And I'll mention one of them to illustrate it. So I was not asked to be chairman by the White House. The Academy usually decides those things. They try to be very independent. And the previous president of the Academy, who was from UC San Francisco actually, I think chose me to be the chairman of the study. And we had a very short time frame. We had something like 5 weeks to not only gather, focus on the questions, provide answers, and to have the whole thing anonymously peer-reviewed from people all over the country. But one of the questions was, how reliable are these international reviews or assessments that have been published now for 25 or 30 years, 25 years. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is a very, very comprehensive organization that goes into every aspect of climate change, involves scientists from all over the world. There is some government participation, so some people have been worried about that. And we were asked to answer the question for the White House, how good are their assessments? Are they biased? Are they exaggerating? Or the opposite? So it was a very specific set of questions they had us. You know, what could we say about future human health impacts of climate change? Rather specific questions. So that's the way it was couched, and we delivered in 5 weeks. It turned out that President Bush was trying to decide what his government would do with the Kyoto Protocol that was trying to stabilize Earth's climate by dealing with the greenhouse gases. So in the midst of our working on that report, his White House decided not to participate in the Kyoto Protocol. So I'm not sure our report had the immediate impact one way or another. But certainly the report got the country's attention, that we said, yes, there is climate change, it's measurable, it's growing, it's likely to grow much bigger, and so forth.
The reaction to that report and the climate that we've described with regard to partisan politicization of our understanding of what we should do about climate change, that is in part shaped your goals as head of the Academy. I mean, in other words, because science has, in this environment, not necessarily because of anything it's done, some communication problems in making, shall we say that the attack on climate change has led to a questioning of the legitimation of scientific research modes. What have you tried to do about that in terms of communicating broadly the kinds of things you've been saying about science here?
This is a very big set of issues. Certainly climate change is involved, but there are many others too. Like the teaching of evolution, biological evolution, everything we've learned about how central biological evolution is to the way life works. Genetically modified crops, the effectiveness of different medical interventions, you name it. That communication with the general public, people who are not scientists, but who are aware of trends and who want to know what's going on, this is just very important. So I don't remember how many different scientists have said it, but it's that we live in a world now that is just ever more important, ever more dependent on science and technology to provide everyday needs as well as those of the next generation. And yet we understand less and less as a people of where the resources are coming from, how they're being manipulated, how we deal with the waste and so forth. We've got a kind of a separation of the importance of the subject and our dependence on it with knowledge of it. How do things really work? What would happen if we lost the internet? What would happen if we lose electricity? So I think that communication amongst scientists and the general public is ever more important, and yet it's getting harder. Scientists are using more and more jargon and specialized language when they describe things. And it's partly because that's the way science works. The so-called reductionist method, where we go deeper and deeper into a narrow set of topics to be able to understand fundamentally what's going on or how to make a new discovery, that makes it harder to communicate not only across scientific disciplines, but with the general public. So I've been putting a lot of time into these communication issues. How do we avoid just out-and-out misunderstandings? How do we help scientists to understand the importance of communication, how to do it better, how not to exaggerate, but also how to describe the legitimate prospects for fantastic advances, but without overpromising. These are really challenges, and I think important. So I've been putting a lot of time in them.
And also at stake here is making the data that is gathered open to public sources.
Oh yeah.
And among other things. And then there's also the issue of the way publications now have a faster and faster tempo. And so we have, so in other words, science in a way has to really think about these things.
Very much.
Even because it's affecting its communication skills by responding to technology, the new way of publishing, and so on.
And there are practical applications and implications too. For example, some environmental regulations that are designed to protect the public health. People whose industries are being affected or who are otherwise skeptical want to see all the data on which these decisions are being based. And yet the scientific journals are trying to limit the amount of space that's being taken because they're filling up. New journals are being created where these results are being presented, and everybody's trying to save space, make the articles easier to read, but still make them understandable. And then from a fundamental point of view, one fundamental tenet of science is to be able to reproduce someone else's experiment or calculation. Well, if I do a calculation and you're trying to check me, you know, did I do it right? Am I misleading people unintentionally? You would have to see all of the input that went into my experiment or my calculation. So when I publish that result, I have to provide you, as the critic who wants to test things, enough of the essential information so that you can reproduce or try to replicate it, try to check whether it works. And if it does, you can then move on to whatever you want to do. But if it doesn't, you have to call me on it. So that gives us all a responsibility to provide all the necessary information, all the necessary assumptions. So this set of issues has become a big one now, not only in communication, but how to optimize the whole enterprise and to avoid instances that might look like fraud or misleading or somebody pursuing a particular financial advantage, something like this. So there's a lot of action in the scientific community now to do this.
And how do you communicate these new realities and the changes in scientific behavior without changing science in a negative way?
That's a great point, because some of the actions that are underway now to try to make the whole enterprise more transparent, that is, to see through to the bottom line, where did this stuff come from, how reproducible is it, how valuable is it, is putting a crimp on certain practices. And the question is, how necessary is it? For example, there are some fields where now there are requirements in the journals that when you write and publish a new result, you are required to produce just literally everything that went into the calculation, including, if someone asks, access to your old lab notebooks that are sitting in a hallway somewhere. Not just what you've published, but access to everything, so they can check everything. This is hard because the resources don't exist for you to be able to catalog everything, store them, make them available to anybody who asks from all over the world. Some of these things are being proposed now, and some of them are frankly impractical. So we're trying to come up with a balanced approach that will balance the legitimate need to know the details with one's ability to store all the information. For example, drug companies, there have been some notable cases in the last several years of companies that have their own research laboratories who are trying to decide whether, for example, to proceed with the costly development of a particular drug. So they do experiments that try to check on what the early ideas, maybe that came in from another country, what they look like, and can they be substantiated. And in some cases, quite a few cases, the researchers in a pharmaceutical company are unable to substantiate what someone else has already claimed, so they have to decide whether to continue to develop the drug or not. And so far, what I think is some of the work on medical development involves such complex systems that even the things you put into the experiment aren't quite the same as your competitor may think it is. So that a great deal of preparatory work has to be done to sort this out, and it's adding cost. And we don't want to see more cost added to the system.
What would you like to see down the road in terms of climate research? You're very attuned to what's going on in that field. What do you think we need to be looking at?
Well, two main things. One is to continue the observations of the important things on the Earth. The temperatures, the ocean currents, the wind patterns, the precipitation patterns, and the ice amounts and sea level. Those are the key variables. It turns out to measure those things requires a real commitment, because you can't go out and measure something once and say, gee, at 10 o'clock in the morning, the temperature was something in Philadelphia, PA, and something different in San Francisco. You need an enormous amount of data, a number of observations, and they have to be continuous. So it requires a commitment and the technology to measure things, variables like temperature, repeatedly in many places in a continuous way without any offsets. If you bring a new thermometer in, you better make darn sure that it gets the same answer as the previous thermometer, so that you're not just introducing an offset. The second thing is looking forward, of course. How do we make predictions based on the current state of all of these variables as we figuratively light a fire under the system, that we keep adding greenhouse gases that will heat up the surface? How does everything change around the world in important regions? So it's not just averaging over the whole planet, but we have to be able to speak to individual locations. London, Sydney, Australia, Moscow, places like this, as well as all the different separate climates of the United States. So looking forward, we have to know how to process all the data and do the mathematical calculations. It's a little bit similar to weather prediction with some notable differences. So looking at what we have now, we have to maintain these continuous observations, high quality. Some of them involve satellites. And then looking forward, more mathematical talent and computer resources just have to be maintained so that we develop our predictive skills better. Otherwise, humans are not going to know what to expect or how to adapt to it.
One final question. What would you advise a student to prepare for the future as a scientist in whatever field?
I'm pretty conservative there. I think there's no substitute that's dependable without knowing the fundamentals, say, of mathematics. But to assess the human impacts of all of these changes we're undergoing, clearly we need university outputs of all kind. People who understand regional economic development, history, languages, of course. But on the science side, a really solid grounding in mathematics and physics and biology is needed to take on these problems.
And then finally, what do you think we'll get agreements on some of these climate change issues?
I do.
Worldwide?
I do. I've become a little more optimistic in the last several months. I think, for example, the political partisanship in the United States is not going to last. I know enough people on the side of the Republicans who understand that they don't want the situation to become ever more partisan. We can't expect any of our politicians to really understand all of this in detail. I've learned that. But they're smart people. But of course, they don't have the time or background to understand things in detail, so we're not waiting for that. There are ways to attack these problems by for example, more renewable energy that's affordable and reliable and transportable. There are companies, in fact, young people working in companies all around the world who are really refining solar energy and storage of solar energy and wind energy in remarkable ways. And some of these technologies are now competitive even with low oil prices. It's going to take a while because the scale of our energy infrastructure around the world is so imponderably large. It's going to take a while to replace it. But I'm optimistic. I think technology is helping a lot, and I think the general notion that humans are causing a global planetary problem, that notion is growing, especially amongst young people. So I'm becoming more optimistic. And there is a forerunner of an international agreement that came out of Paris in December 2015, which has some good potential to it.
Well, on that positive note, Dr. Cicerone, I want to thank you very much for being on our program and helping us understand what science is all about.
Thank you.
And thank you very much for joining us for this conversation with history.